So after we have about a 10-minute presentation from each panelist, then we're going to open it up for discussion, and that's a chance for people to make oral comments, or again, we'll try to moderate and make sure we don't lose any good questions. And then we'll move to the next panelist. So if we go through the three panelists, that should then leave us 15 to 20 minutes at the end to really have a synthetic kind of free-for-all discussion. So this just is a reminder for who our panelists are, and our first panelist is my colleague, Jeremy Rochelle from SRI. All of the panelists were asked to think about these guiding questions, which I think they're familiar with. We'll just move right on from there. I've talked about the format. We've talked about how you can unmute your phone and ask or type it in chat. And let's pass the presentation to Jeremy. I will mute, and you can go, Jeremy.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about SimCalc and our history with that. And Erin is going to show a little quick document I prepared for that. There you go. And many of you know SimCalc, and there's not much time to go into depth, but just a couple of overview points. It's been going on for 18 years, many institutions participating in the research, so it's kind of an umbrella of an initiative. The mission has been stable, which is, if we think of it as democratizing the mathematics of change and variation. That is loosely the mathematics of rates and changes. It feeds into calculus, for example. That's been the core content for a long time. The core technology has been dynamic representations, which allows students to manipulate graphs and see the implications for motion. And the core pedagogical value has been on conceptual understanding of foundational math, particularly for kids who are often tracked into much more basic skills kind of math. Well, what were the core design decisions? Well, there's too many to count over 18 years. And they were made in every possible way. If someone on the panel were to name a way a decision could be made, I'm sure there's one we made that way. Including probably throwing darts at the wall. But broadly speaking, the methods we used, especially in the beginning, was design research, where we would try things out and try them with small numbers of people and see what happens, which progressed towards teaching experiments, which were slightly more formalized. Those were largely case studies in particular schools, and then we progressed eventually towards experimental studies at really quite a considerable scale. I think the largest was 95 classrooms participating simultaneously, and those were very quantitative in nature, measuring outcomes and instruments to measure how much teachers knew, students' prior knowledge, all kinds of logging data. But I want to emphasize also that those had embedded case studies. So while the umbrella study was large and quantitative, we also knew a lot of details about some of what went on there. And so I could talk about any of that to the panel's questioning. And so I just picked two questions that I thought I could elaborate a little bit on in the 10 minutes. What are some exemplary decisions and how did we make them is what Barbara asked me to focus on. So one question is, why is our 7th grade module, which is what we did the largest research with, about rate proportionality? And there's a trivial answer to that question. The answer is because we were working with Uri Treisman in Texas, and he said you can't work with 8th grade students. And rate and proportionality was what was in the Texas state standards and in the NCTM focal points and fit our software. So we did it. That's the trivial answer. The deeper answer, though, is really, you can go quite deep. Jim Caput was a scholar of the history of mathematics, and his reasoning included studying the growth of math from the 14th century to the present, and really deeply thinking about the structure of mathematics and what the right learning progressions were. There was also copious developmental evidence. One example would be from the Rational Number Project, which for many years very deeply looked at proportional reasoning, and all the successors to that project. So there's a lot of stuff in developmental views of how students build mathematics. And then there was input from technology. What could we do that was new and could have an impact? And here I emphasize that one of the core things SimCalc tries to do is to interconnect formal and informal reasoning, that's the left to the right dimension on the little 4 squares, and graphical and symbolic reasoning. And so in the formal graphical slot, we have graphs, which we connected to animations of motion to the right, to stories below that, and also to algebraic expressions to the left of that. And that became a guiding framework. The building of that series of connections became a guiding framework. We care about kids understanding the meaning of mathematics. Many people in mathematics education see meaning as connections, and these are the particular connections we are trying to build. And I can go layers more specific on that. In graphs, we care about slope. In animation, we care about speed. Those both represent rate in those 2 different ones. The stories would tell stories about how fast, speed, and the algebraic expressions, we're interested in the multiplicative parameter, if it was y equals kx to k, because that would be the representation of rate in that format. So that's one example of how we made a serious and important decision that guided the work. What is our content? And flip, and I chose one other, sort of another extreme of the scale. In our work, we really try to emphasize that this is not technology as a silver bullet, but what is making a difference when we measure differences in classrooms is the integration of 3 things coming together: the technology, the curriculum workbooks, and the professional development offered to the teachers. And again, you can have a kind of trivial story of why do we do that. Well, we found that teachers aren't that good if you just throw a technology at them at pulling it together themselves in a coherent way and sustained way. And basically, you get some teachers who could do that, but overall your variability would be so high about how teachers chose to use the technology that you wouldn't get robust results. You diminish your effects. So instead, we have the technology, which has the kind of magic, with a curriculum that can guide teachers and students through it in 2 to 3 weeks, and the professional development that gives teachers the comfort to use the technology, the experience with it, that refreshes their knowledge of this content area, and sort of emphasizes, like I said, basic experience, but some basic high-level things like what are the big ideas that we're trying to teach in this unit, so it orients them to that. You'll notice in that list, we don't change them or seek to change them into reform-oriented teachers practicing a constructivist pedagogy, because our design has always emphasized, we only got a week with these teachers. What can we do that's going to get this working in schools that year? And you can't change teachers, everyone knows, you can't change teachers into constructivist reform-oriented teachers in a 3-day summer workshop. So that's not on our list of how we design this. And then, if you look on the other end of the spectrum, what went into that, really tons of evidence at all kinds of levels have focused on what is this integration of technology, curriculum, and professional development. So we have student workbooks. In our big experiments, we collected every student workbook, and we've analyzed those. Which pages were kids working on? Where do you see misconceptions? What work is the workbook doing? And we found very strong evidence that kids who do more of the work in the workbook and do it with more attention to the details and the complexity being called for learn more. So we know the workbooks make a difference. We also have discourse analysis and video analysis that tells us a lot about what kids are talking about in classrooms when they implement this and how that works. We have interviews with all the teachers and with many students that we conducted to understand how this integration was working for the teachers. What did they like about it? And in fact, many people see the magic of SimCalc not being the technology, because you can find other technologies like it, but how the workbooks really lay it out in a very integrated, guided way. And teachers really like that. And then we've done all kinds of exploratory data analysis on our large data set to look at, for example, if teachers know more math, do they learn more? Do the students learn more in their classrooms? So is high math content knowledge a prerequisite to using SimCalc? The answer, by the way, is basically no. In some cases, there are teachers who use high content knowledge to teach this material very well, but we also have wonderful examples of very low content knowledge teachers doing a great job with these materials too. And so there's not a straightforward correlation between those two. And an example of what we get out of that kind of work is a kind of failure analysis, where we looked at the classrooms where it didn't work well, and students didn't appear to learn anything, and asked why. What was the blocking behavior that prevented learning in what's otherwise working in lots of classrooms and schools? And the kinds of things we found from that failure analysis are things like teachers who won't relinquish control and won't let the students ever do anything and won't let them say very much. We found examples of extreme favoritism where a teacher really believed in their interview that there was only 5 boys in their class that could learn math, and actually enacted that in the classroom, only paying attention to the 5 boys. So we found that there's a series of blocking behaviors that could really get in the way. Another teacher that was in our failure analysis was skipped material. She would get, the material was designed to be gone through in a very logical way, and she would get wherever she got to on day 1, which might have been half the way through, and then just go to day 2's lesson, perhaps ignoring half of day 1's lesson. And she did that repeatedly, and that classroom they were missing half the content. So we've looked at kind of what works and doesn't work, and that's feeding into, on the next round of PD and the next revisions to the workbooks, how do we organize those to get that integration even better. So that's my short thing. I don't know if it was 10 minutes or not, but that's a short introduction.
That was perfect, Jeremy. I think that was exactly 10 minutes. Maybe I'll kick off with a question, and then others can kick in. I think one of the things that's really interesting is to think about the time frame for this work. So I was going to kind of ask you about the two ends of it. First was the amount of time that you spent before you really felt ready for the large-scale test of the effectiveness that you did in Texas. How long that took, and what you saw as the advantage of doing these smaller scale studies. Would speeding them up have been useful for you if they could have been done more quickly, or would there be a downside to that? And then my other question, I'm cheating to get 2 in here. On the other end of it, you talked about this, the analysis you did of all the student workbooks, and of course those were handwritten, and then likewise the kind of failure analysis of the classrooms, because you had this rich set of data, you could look at that. But what if the student workbooks and the classroom records had actually been captured by technology? How much more quickly could you have done that analysis, and could you have maybe given some feedback more in real time rather than post hoc adding to the literature? So those were my 2 questions.
Yeah. Yes. Boy, that's quite a sweep of questions. So one thing I think, here's sort of fragments of answers. In the germination phase of SimCalc, I have the original video Jim Caput made when he was proposing the project. And there's almost nothing from that video that's in SimCalc today. So that initial set of 2 projects, that was 6 years, actually changed everything. Really the only thing that remained was the mission and the knowledge of the people. So I don't know how you can speed that up, because we thought we were doing one thing, and we gradually learned from interaction with kids and teachers what was and wasn't working, kind of followed our noses. And so that was that part. I think that's, it's really important that NSF, for example, gives you the flexibility to be wrong, and a grant instrument lets you self-correct and do something different the next year, which really paid off for us in that first phase. As far as the middle part you drew attention to, which was kind of piloting to get ready for scale-up, that took a lot of work. The materials that we had coming out of the first phase were really Jim Caput's lecture notes in a way, and we learned very quickly that that wasn't sufficient to guide most teachers, and there was a level of focus and professionalism in the creation of the curriculum workbooks that was going to be needed. And so having a year, actually it was like 2 years, I think, to work that out and pilot it and get feedback was really important. The main thing that would speed that up is if we could have school not take a year, and so that like you could start 7th grade in a staggered fashion, because really what takes a lot of time is waiting for the topic to cycle around so you can have 3 weeks again. And we could go a lot faster if we had a different cohort starting 7th grade every month. But we don't have that choice. And then towards the end of the thing, you asked about the workbooks. It was actually not that expensive or time-consuming to do that. The way we did it was we hired teachers over the summer to code them. And they took about a month to go through 95 classrooms of workbooks, which isn't horrible. And we had a coding scheme, and we focused them on certain pages that we thought had more value. And yes, I think it would be good if those could have been scanned and digitized, because it would let you do things like more quickly yank out particular response areas and compare those directly. Like we had kids draw graphs, it wasn't all, or we had them write stories. And it'd be nice if you could pull out a random sample or a pile of the response to the same graph drawing exercise and quickly see the variability, rather than flipping in thousands of workbooks to that page to see what's going on. So I think tools for that kind of document analysis could really play off. We found that the workbooks had really valuable information. I'm a little reluctant, unless kids have styluses and stuff, to go to them doing all their work online, because we get so much value out of their informal stories and writing. And I think we'd lose a lot if they had to type everything or use a mouse. A mouse is a terrible input device for a lot of what we were doing.
It looks like Bill Penuel has a question.
What?
I said it looks like Bill Penuel has a question.
Sorry, just unmuting. So, Jeremy, during the design-based research phase, which was a long time, you presumably had a lot of decisions that you made and rationales for those decisions, and also some evidence that you wish you'd collected earlier on but didn't. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on the sort of data that you wish you'd collected that, to prep you for this scale-up phase earlier.
Yeah. Well, the assessment end of this could have sped up the project by, we didn't really have an assessment expert in the early years. To some extent, Dick Lesh came in and did some of that, but it takes a long time to build good quality assessments, and because we were in part going beyond what, for example, the Texas state measures really underrepresent the knowledge we were going for. So we did have to build our own measures, and so having more attention to assessment earlier would have been good, for sure. And that's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of that.
Do we have some other questions for Jeremy?
This is Ken. I guess following up on the question about instrumenting the workbooks, do you think, given that something like a stylus or a pencil is important here, does that suggest that kind of as a research goal for the future that we need to perhaps solve handwriting recognition of mathematical representations as a way to facilitate this kind of faster collection of data?
Right. I mean, I've been an avid follower of both the ability to, there's some technologies to translate symbolic handwritten expressions into math, to recognize that a 2 superscript is squared. And there's also some projects that have been doing stuff with graph recognition and can give you some basic information on the shape of the graph kids draw. Is it concave or is it convex? And those kind of things to scan the stuff would be helpful. And in addition, we did actually use number recognition stuff in the workbooks. There were, the workbooks had an array of squares where the kids wrote out numbers, and the machine coding of them was actually fairly useful. So we did use some machine coding.
Right.
But it was only for numbers. All we could recognize was numbers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And part of that was, and part of this whole project was a judgment call on what was going to work in 95 classrooms at the time we were there. And so, for example, we could have run SimCalc on graphing calculators, but we didn't, because 7th grade teachers in Texas at that time didn't use graphing calculators, they used computers. And we didn't really want to convince them. Graphing calculators have a harder interface to use, and so that was what went into that decision. But technologies and what schools and teachers are useful change over time, and so if we were doing a study today, we might pick a different core implementation than the laptop one. We also didn't want to trust the internet, so we delivered our content we burned CDs and had them installed. And that decision might change today because we might believe schools have a reliable enough internet. We didn't then. Actually, I think we're right.
Jeremy, I have one last question, kind of as a transition between you and Greg. I think that the work that you did is a classic, really, in going from the stage of a number of early design research studies through your early teaching studies and then building up to really large-scale, rigorous, and replicated research. But looking at what we might do going forward in the future, if you were to do it over again, and thinking about that early phase of your work, when there always is limited resources for your research, and in a way you have a trade-off between how many different environments you can have your developing intervention being used in, so you gather feedback from that of various kinds, some of it quite informal, and getting early evidence of impact. You talked about not having good assessment measures, which partly kept you from getting early evidence of student outcomes. But if you were doing it today and had your assessment expert at the ready hand, how would you do it today?
Oh, I'd do it all over again. Well, I guess the trade-off that comes to mind is, some ideas take a while to brew, and so prematurely narrowing down, I don't think allows the level of innovation that we felt we had in the early years. And so I don't necessarily want to make the jump to we would know our assessment measures in the first year, because understanding what it was that we were accomplishing was one of the things that happened. So allowing for a team to gel and for time for these things to co-influence each other seems important to me, and that's why. But on the other hand, I think 18 years is excessive. Actually, the core work here was done faster than that, and yeah, of course we should try to speed things up. And so but I don't have a brilliant thing to say about how I would better do that balance right now.
Okay. Well, let's come back to that question maybe at the end. I'd like to get started with Greg's presentation. He can frame it a little bit in the time frame he was working, and I think he had some constraints on time that maybe you didn't quite face. So, Aaron, if you could pass the presenter role to Greg, he can take it away.
So the project I'm going to talk about is part of a Center for Advanced Technology in Schools. The PI is Eva Baker, OPI is Keith Holyoke from UCLA Psychology, and me. So I've aligned the comments along those three questions. And so I'm just going to jump straight into sort of issues we ran across and some of the decisions we made. So a little background on the project. So it's a 5-year Center grant where we're charged with developing math games for underperforming middle school students. And so the first part is to develop the games, test them, and then the second part is to run a randomized control trial. So we just started the randomized control trial. We have around 80 classrooms, and that's going on right now. So my comments will be reflecting on the development process that led up to the big study. So in terms of content, we started with a fixed content from the proposal, and that was back in 2008, 2009, and we were lucky enough to be on the mark based on some other work going on at the center, and so the content part, which is rational numbers, solving equations and functions, remained the same throughout the project. And so that was important because that guided decisions about the assessments, the instruction, and the professional development. And the list of sort of issues that we came across in designing games. Well, the first one was this ongoing tension between the game developers and the education researcher types. That is, game developers would say, and this is a math game, right? So, oh no, can't put math in the game because it's going to destroy the game. Math being the symbolic expressions and equations and all that. So, and it was sort of new at the time, and we had no basis for strongly pushing back to the game designers. We wanted games that were engaging, and so we sort of went back and forth on that. So throughout the 2 years of development, it evolved from minimal math instruction in a game to sort of like not putting increasingly more math, symbolic stuff in the game. Our numbers were showing that if you put more symbolic content in the math game, they do better on math problems. It's sort of a duh, but in terms of the kinds of, game type, game-specific content, we would design the game levels so that it would scale the content and go from easy to hard or more complex. We also had tutorial formats where we started from sort of the traditional, present the information, content, and then let the students play the game, and then introduce the next concept, go play the game, and this is all within the game context. But that sort of turned out to be a dead end. If you play games, they don't typically unfold that way. So we sort of ran into this we would observe through timing data based on the logs and classroom observations and all of that sort of the kids were essentially just clicking through the instruction, and they were just, so that was sort of a loser. Technology sort of played a role in that. In the early days of the development, the game engine couldn't support sort of multimedia like audio, and so as we transitioned from one game engine to the next, and so our second huge iteration through the games folded in audio, video, and so forth. And probably one of the biggest issues and positive changes was we moved the game development from external game developers to an internal development team. So that really helped in terms of turnaround and synergy and coherence in the games. The second question or set of decisions related to learner interaction. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things we discovered about game design, games, at least I did, was that it's sort of like to date it's one of the more complex products because it's got to be engaging or fun. it's got to, at least in math, teach content that isn't fun. It involves software development, and so it involves a whole set of different or varied skills. So it becomes really complex. And so, let's see, and so designing and developing an effective game that sort of balances the fun engagement aspect and the effectiveness, I think is still an open question. And if you check back in about 6 months, I can tell you whether we're effective or not. Another issue that we came across was sort of the role of the game and teacher. So initially we started thinking that the game would be a standalone product that could teach fraction concepts. As it turned out, throughout the development testing part, we're observing sort of mixed results: effective, not effective, gains, no gains. Seem to be mediated by grades and game experience. There's possibly some gender effects, and through a lot of classroom observations, where as the researchers, we'd be sitting in the back of the class and watching, how the teachers and the kids were playing a game. It sort of we evolved to the idea of game as not necessarily is going to teach everything, but more provide sort of unique opportunities in the sense that kids could explore the concepts in the game and make a lot of mistakes, and that was important because as the kids would make mistakes, and this is typically in a lab setting, as they make mistakes, they would raise their hands, and because of the differences in pacing, that the hands wouldn't all go up at the same time, and so then the teacher would come around and would sort of like help the kids individually, and so. And when we looked at student responses, on so the post game surveys, and they would say, "Oh, wow, this is like a unique experience for them because they, had the opportunity to talk to their teacher." And from the teacher's side, it was like, "Well, this is great. I get to help this specific kid, if only to get them over the hump." But it's sort of this individualized instruction. In a way that we hadn't thought about before, and the other component was so game as a bridge to more formal classroom instructions. So where the teacher would use the game context. Remember, in this game, when you did this, this, and that related, that relates to common denominators or whatever the instruction was, and as an aside, the game as a data source is like it's just a boatload of data that can be mined. And in fact, we have used sort of cluster analysis to detect interesting student patterns that are also consistent with the literature. So that was cool. Right. So the last. I guess the question relates to user testing decisions, and I think you've all probably seen, this is like common, right? So school technology, we just assume that it's going to be high variability. So we bought a classroom set of laptops, we ran the studies with laptops, and then one of the duh moments was for the efficacy trial. What we've ended up doing is basically putting everything on a USB stick, and so kids execute the program off of the USB sticks, and the game is logging data to that USB sticks, and that just solves a whole lot of problems, sort of back to the 80s. The other thing is, so we're running into this big efficacy trial, and we can't get 10 days of instructional time from anyone, prior to this. So what we ended, and we needed to test, all the games in one setting, end to end. So as it turns out, summer school is being cut from a lot of districts. So we just offered up to the district, hey, we'll sponsor summer school. They said, yeah, great. And so we just tested all their games in 6 weeks. Okay, I think I'm running over, but I just want to say, and the last slide is just a series of steps where we're at now in terms of the user testing sequence. Lots of develop the instruction, test the instruction, develop the game, test the game, and then at that point, we're ready for formal testing of instructional or game design variables. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Greg. I think one of the things you you explained and very concretely was how it was really helpful for you to watch this being used in actual classroom settings where you could watch what the students were doing and clicking through, and you could watch how students and teachers were interacting as well as having the log data. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about was all of the embedded kinds of very quick A/B experiments you did with different versions of the game. I think it was 24 in a year or two, some incredible number. So you had both the observation data, the kind of data you might get from design research, and also the more experimental data that was more quantitative. How much do you think the latter really added and changed your design process to what it would have been if you had taken a more traditional design research approach?
So you mean the observation, the qualitative information?
If you had mostly, yes, depended on qualitative information and just been using one version of the game and then refined it based on feedback and what you were seeing, and more in cycles, similar to the early SimCalc days.
So the qualitative information sort of helped explain the quantitative in that, and it really lent insight into how the games could be used in a practical setting under field conditions, and it provided. Sort of the whole idea of game as a teachable moment. That was definitely through observations and talking to teachers and reading student responses. I don't think we would have gotten there strictly from quantitative analysis of the gameplay data.
Okay. Looks like Bill Penuel has a question about perhaps some upsides to working with external developers.
Yeah, it's just an observation. I've seen another research team that dealt with some of the same issues around coherence that it sounds like you've dealt with. But the upside is that this is a group that did active programming methods, and it required the research team to be very explicit about things like interface design and interaction design, and it ended up creating a nice little record for them that they hadn't had in their design-based research process up to that point. So it's more a comment than a question. It just seems like, yes, there's a downside in terms of coordination with people who don't quite get what you're doing, but it creates a record that often doesn't exist in design-based research in terms of like what are the design decisions, what's the design thinking, and it's kind of a historical record that could be useful in terms of really as a source of evidence.
Barbara, I don't have any. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I don't have any video, so I'm just going to ask my question. Can he give some examples of A/B comparisons that they made so we get some idea of of what the hell they're testing.
You sound like Alan Collins, but that was exactly the question from Ken Cadinger.
Okay, that's my question. Yes, it was Alan Collins.
Okay, well.
Alan.
Two bodies, one brain.
So the way we, for example, feedback versus no feedback was one study, or degree of math language in the game.
What was the result, though?
Of which one? I mean, so I'm sorry.
Why don't you talk about both of them?
Oh, okay. So early on, we actually the very first study, we had compared the game developer developed the levels, and it's very procedural. And then we took those levels and modified them to be more conceptual with more explanatory content. So we went off to summer school, tested it with middle school and high school students in urban high school. And we found that, if it was more conceptual, they did a little better on the post-test, marginally. So that was one finding. We also looked at their perceptions of the gaminess of the game, like basically how fun was it. And they reported significantly higher satisfaction with the game that was more conceptual or more mathy, I guess. And so that result sort of led us down a path where we started beginning to see, well, maybe the math part, maybe the game designers maybe the inclusion of explicit math content isn't as bad. But then of course we're listening to the game design. Oh no, don't put in the equations and all that. Another example was sort of the same idea, but in a tutorial mode, where the initial you fire up the game, you're going to learn this concept, and then go practice. You're going to learn the next concept, go practice. So that we varied the tutorial aspect along the same, mathy or more conceptual. In that one, there's no difference. So that was a little puzzling. And then on the feedback one, feedback, no feedback. It's a feedback, no feed, and then a bunch of other instruction, format studies, I guess. And sort of the condition that had essentially no feedback did the best. So that was like even more what? Right? Like and so essentially, let the kids play, they'll figure it out. And so that I sort of at that point we started transitioning from the game will teach towards a game. And in the meantime, we were doing these classroom observations and seeing how things are working with teachers and like other studies, and that so we sort of at that point we pivoted towards, well, let's try and include more of the teacher component and maybe the game as a way to expose students' knowledge gaps, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, well, I want to make sure we have time for Zoran's presentation, and then if we have more questions for Greg, we can come back to it. Thank you very much, Greg, and then I think now we'll hear a little bit different development and tryout process from Zoran. If you can pass the presenter role. Looks like you already did. Great, Aaron.
Okay. I started writing. I had about 16 of these, but then I realized I should just get the salient points across. So, and of course, this is this is a very early stage of the study, but one way in which we are doing these studies is we actually have the data right away on a lot of things, which is already allowed me to make some of these statements here, even though they might be relatively preliminary or on only 1 or 2 points of data. But just as a background, the first point is general. Really, I came to this from sort of scientific discovery games that I was developing that enabled sort of surprising narrow but deep experts to emerge from play of over 3 months or so. Then the question was, how can I sort of basically create that kind of learning in the context of, in this case, early math? And as a computer scientist, one of the first things that I realized is that computer scientists are highly impatient, and they cannot wait for the trials to finish in any way whatsoever. So I had to figure out a way in which I can somehow gather the data at really rapid speeds, so that I can draw conclusions and adapt the process dynamically. So in many ways, I'm trying to learn, and I have sort of a lot of experts advising me on a lot of conceptual or existing knowledge out there. But really, I'm trying to be sort of as much data-driven as possible in this exploration. So, and one thing that became obvious is that the system of a student material and the context in which the student is purportedly to learn this material is highly complex. There's so many variables in each one of those 3 items that it's no wonder that it's really hard to unravel the mystery of how to best teach to a specific person. So what that to me meant is that if I were starting to do A/B tests on all possible variables in this space, it's just I wouldn't be done in 2 lifetimes of 4 or 10. So the question was, how can I basically create very rapid mass-scale randomized trials on millions of kids in order to actually at least cover a portion of some of these perhaps most important variables within the space. And the other thing that was important to me is that I do this in vivo. And what I mean by that is that I don't have an experiment where I bring kids in and they have to do the pre-test and they have to do the post-test and they have to persist through playing the game, but to actually have them playing anywhere in the world just because they've heard about it, and that I will get some more data and learn something about how people learn in the process. And of course, that is a big, very big hurdle in the sense that, and as you'll see, some of the challenges emerge from that. The second point is that there's a very big, if you wanted to have a single intervention that somehow can apply to learning anywhere, anytime, you quickly realize that it has to be a fairly flexible thing such that it can adapt to different things, because in classrooms, just very, very different things are done than when you're at home or when you're sort of discovering something yourself. And so what we ended up doing is creating basically different modalities within which the game can be played in such a way that actually there are ways in which the teacher can actually be a co-player, or a parent can be a co-player in the actual experiencing through the play, but also teacher and a parent should have some kind of way of understanding what the game itself is discovering in the process, and we realized that exposing this right away was very important. The third point points to just this in vivo data. So everybody that we're doing an experiment on, we might have some demographic data because of the channel through which we're distributing the game, but ultimately everybody out there is unwatched as they're playing the game. So that means that's good in a sense because I can get potentially 1 million kids. It's bad because I have even more variables introduced to the system, many of which are completely unmeasurable. But the biggest problem that I've noticed is that when you start including pre and post tests in this kind of experimental paradigm, the tests are just a complete killer. It's like to anything that entice these kids to actually play the thing. So we find that more than 30% of the kids are just lost by the prestats even before they actually get to the game. So now in the subsequent studies, what we're doing is leveraging the actual things that they actually like about the game, and we're positioning it in such a way that they will get an instant gratification if they persevere through the test. And we're, of course, making the test a lot shorter and interspersed, such that the suffering is minimized, at least in duration. Another point is that one of the first tests that we've done on 6,000 kids through K-12 is that something that obviously I guess a lot of you could have told me is that, and perhaps something we knew as well, but that's the only thing we can do, is one game play session is not enough. So if you just play once for 1 hour, no matter what kind of thing, even if it's the best in the world one-on-one tutor, the effect probably would be relatively small. So we no longer will do any of those kinds of trials anymore. Basically, we're everything from now on will be a part of the gameplay through a social game world, where they would really want to return for a whole bunch of different social and reward incentives, as opposed to just here's an experience, you've completed it, now what? The other point is that the linear game progression, just basically a sequence through which you need to go through, is actually a very bad idea in my mind. And what you often see is no matter how smooth or how rapid or how accurate your progression may be for a particular learner, the children would quit in this kind of in vivo setup very quickly at the point where they realize the boundaries of their ability. Namely, when they reach that crucial learning point, it's if the content is linear, that's pretty much it. So what we've incorporated as a result of this is multiple mechanisms for exploratory gameplay. So basically, you never feel constrained to a particular singular path, but you actually feel like you can go through and explore and tell your own story as you play the game. However, of course, for it to be relevant, what the game is doing is it's dynamically changing the content, so that even though the kids feel like they're exploring everything, the information of what kid has done is immediately dynamically changing the next set of experiences that they quote-unquote stumble upon. The next point is something that we'll be studying on for a lot now is that static progression or even authored adaptation turns out to be highly inflexible. So what we're finding often is this triaging, where the advanced students, through a static progression, if it doesn't advance too fast enough for them to get to the place where it's interesting, it's viewed as too boring. Similarly, if it doesn't present themselves with sufficient number of good feeling moments and wins initially, the struggling students would find it too hard. And this is why sort of the fundamental underpinnings of our development is twofold. One is it's purely on-the-fly data-driven adaptation based on on-game determined understanding and learning preferences, and two, the highly procedural authoring of the game. So basically, every game that we're developing can have infinite number of levels that automatically generate based on the experience in the game. The 7th point is that, and this I think is something perhaps maybe something that a lot of people don't realize when I think, is that single context, I guess the way that I phrase it here, it will be obvious to you. So single context does not lead to deep conceptualization. So so what that means for games is that no single game can possibly have really impactful effect on conceptual understanding. And the reason for that is that you see kids very quickly sort of overfitting or self-adapting to just be really good at that game and do that game really well, as opposed to understanding the concepts. Because as soon as you start to understand the game, there is no more need for deep conceptualization. You now over-specialize to being highly efficient for that game. And so what we're finding is in our experiment on these K-12 kids is that we see what I call myopic transfer, or not transfer at all. So what we see is they're able to procedurally do things highly efficiently in terms of what the game is showing, but the conceptual ability to transfer that onto a completely different concept doesn't exist. And so our design principles really are introducing something what I call virtual learning transfer. And it's hopefully a real learning transfer, only it's in a virtual environment, in the sense that the games are connected in a world that basically figures out exactly at which point to, through incentive structures, switch learners from one type of game to another, each one of them having highly different contexts. So what that enables us to do is to ask a question, well, if these kids can do these mathematical concepts really well in this game, can they also do it in 3 or 4 other games and do exactly the same mathematical concepts? And if the answer is yes, of course the fundamental studies will show later on, but I think I will feel a lot more confident that there's a likelihood that they will transfer onto other things, including tests. Now, of course, what this means is that the design of all these levels has to have a common design language, in the sense that you can actually say, I can tell you that the only way to solve these 3 levels in these 3 completely different games is by using exactly the same mathematical concept. And to be able to do that, you have to design it in a particular way such that that's possible. And the final point is that as we are working towards getting this accessible to more and more students through our sort of unrolling process, we're finding that the distribution mechanisms really are teachers and parents. And so what that means is, I guess because they're the ones that eventually will introduce this to kids, especially those kids in early math or maybe middle school still, because it's going to be really hard for kids to just say, oh, hey, I don't like this Halo game, I want to play this game on fractions. But however, if there's a way in which teachers and parents can be drawn to actually entice this thing towards their students, we will have a lot better sort of introduction rate. And so what we've done is we changed a whole bunch of mechanisms within the games to make this highly relevant and appealing to both teachers and parents. And this ranges from the teacher being able to directly assign homework sets. We call them home plays, actually, in such a way that kids just go home and plays a game, and without any grading or whatever, in the morning, the teacher gets exactly the right measurement of what everybody understands or doesn't. Similarly, they can actually take part of play, and they can sort of swoop down and become angels within gameplay. And we even sort of now looking into ways of providing teaching hints to teachers for every misconception that the game identifies through play. So I'll wrap it up here.
Oh, that's great. Fascinating. So let's open it up for questions here for Zoran. while we're waiting.
Well, there were a lot of questions I see here.
Yes, there are. Do you see one you'd like to attack? I was going to ask you about the kind of feedback that you are, the kind of information that you are providing to teachers that they want to see. I was wondering if it looks kind of like what we're used to seeing on a lot of learning systems where they get, red, yellow, green on each skill in the standards for whatever the topic is, or is it something quite different?
Yeah, we do have a way to show Common Core standards, but what we realized is that they're not granular enough, and this is why I think I said somewhere micro concepts that we're able to sort of describe. So basically, we for each one of those big rubrics that Common Core has, there's basically possibly 4 or 5 different ways kids can be confused on them. So we felt that it was more relevant to actually point that out than to actually have coloring on the concept itself. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's interesting is that there's sort of a partial ordering of concepts or micro concepts that we could uncover from this data that can basically say, for this kid, perhaps taking this path through the curriculum is more efficient than something else, and this, of course, would be informative to teachers.
And how much data do you have on which you base that recommendation? What kind of data do you base it on?
Well, right now I actually now have lined up 500,000 kids for next year and a half, so we'll be very busy. But what we're actually developing is a technology to be able to leverage the data in order to make those particular recommendations in such a way that it would have been already exemplified in the data as to being efficient.
I'm going to pause a minute to give someone else a chance.
I thought I'd ask my question out loud, and maybe in a slightly more pointed way, which is, I don't see much of a conceptualization of a role for teachers in either of the last 2 presentations, and I'm just sort of wondering, how do you all think of the role of teachers and the role of teaching, not online, but in the sort of the blended learning model? And then for you, if you do have a role, what implications does that have for collecting evidence related to usability, implementation, and effectiveness?
Well, we're going to go to classrooms in the spring already, and probably we'll be cycling this for 2 years before we really have a comprehensive answer to that. But what I have found out is that different teachers are willing to use this kind of thing in completely different amounts, and this is why we're kind of designing it towards those that don't really want to touch it because they're too worried about their test and what they really need to cover, to those that are actually more innovative and then say, well, I want to customize it exactly towards what my needs are. So our goal is basically to collect the data not just on students but on teachers as well, and figure out which modalities.
But it sounds like you have a let 1,000 flowers bloom there. And might there not be some research on teaching with technology that you could draw on to start to provide, for example, some implementation guidelines? And I think that's something, for example, that Ken did with the tutor, is to really think about what's the offline component here. How do I teach with this stuff? I would actually say that we're fairly weak in terms of actually creating exactly explicit instructions. We will have basically best practices kind of threads that they could use them. However, what we will do is actually create a social infrastructure where through which I hope that this actually will go viral, right? Because if some of the teachers find very creative pathways, most other teachers should know about this. And what's the way to do that is basically to have a sort of a social teachers' social panel around the use of the game, and that's actually going to be built into the framework itself.
To what extent are you getting pressure to show that the time spent on this game, that would be in a school setting, is well spent. That is, that students have better learning outcomes than they would if they were doing instruction as usual. Are you feeling that pressure? That's the first part of the question. And then if you are, it seems that it will be difficult for you to try to do that kind of demonstration without having some kind of model of how you intend for teachers to integrate it with their practice. So it kind of relates to Bill's question in that way.
Right. I mean, there are a number of different kind of forms of questions one can pose. But what I would say is that if how would you structure it such that you compare it to the best possible otherwise use of that time, right? I'm not quite sure. We have some particular modalities of this, including actually using the game as a nexus point for the material. So imagine if you can have a game where if you're stuck, it basically points to the Khan Academy snippets that would actually help you resolve it, right? If you have the right incentive structure within the game, you could actually embed the entire curriculum this way in such a way that kids would actually care about trying to understand it, as opposed to being presented with a material as sort of, well, you should just know this. There are a number of different possibilities. I think I'm mostly. What I would like to show is that we can actually effectively remove some of these bottlenecks completely through standalone play, and that's basically the holy grail. Now, even if an instructional methodology can actually resolve that, the question is, well, how many effective teachers out there in the world that can actually do that, right? And the answer is probably very few. So I think that I'm actually less concerned about comparing it to the best possible imaginable practice as much as, look, here's an extremely cheap way with which you can actually be highly effective, and anybody with a smartphone can have something that's exactly uniquely adapted to them.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. Ken has a really good question.
What example of level transfer are you after from task access? I see. Yeah. So
examples.
Yeah, there are several different things that I'm trying to do. So one is obviously. So I'll just give you an example, right? So you're saving some animals from the world, like you've played Refraction. I know. But okay, so at some point you say, okay, well, can you now play a completely different game? It's a social card game between kids that's similar to Tetra or Uno, with exactly the same mathematical expressions there, because I can actually stack the deck exactly the way I like it. Or how can you play this platformer that requires you to sort of navigate in a similar way as Super Nintendo kind of a format, but also have a different kind of representation of fractions themselves. So the idea is context completely changes. Sometimes it's quick twitch, sometimes it's social, sometimes it's thinking in a puzzle game. Completely different environment, completely different mechanics. What did you get from playing one or two games that can be applied to the third one? And the final one is how can you, let's say you learn a task X that has a particular kinds of concepts, and task Y that has some other concept. Now, can you do task Z, which requires you to amalgamate the two concepts together such that you can solve some harder problem? So in other words, and that's what I really think is true transfer, is can you actually use the thing that you know towards solving a problem that requires you to combine it with other things that you know.
Do you ever look at transfer to a task that is not game-based? Same concepts, but not game.
Yeah, I have to do it with a lot of these pre and post tests, right? Because I can't to just show effectiveness in general that can transfer onto tests. But ultimately, telemetrically speaking, the only thing I can do is test in the virtual world.
Yeah. I had one final question, Zoran. You mentioned that now you're getting a lot of data going through classrooms, but at least initially, a lot of people would sign on. You'd know what address they're coming from, but you don't really know who they are. You don't know whether they're in 6th grade or 8th grade or 4th grade or even an adult.
Yeah.
Do you find, to what extent is that really a disadvantage in trying to make sense of the data?
Yeah, I mean, there are actually, I mean, through K-12, we actually have completely anonymized demographics, which is wonderful. Even like, reduced lunch or whatever it's called, kind of measures. We're doing actually tests in juvenile prisons. I'm lining up something in New York State and in Washington State. I also have sort of Ministry of India. A Minister of Education of India committed to 1 million students in a year or two. So I will have a wide variety of kids with some data. And also, I don't know if you've heard of Edmodo, but it's sort of like a Facebook for schools. They also have demographic and sort of social interaction stuff in their network, and we're looking into distributing through that because we have direct access of all the interactions, and we know in this case the kind of school everybody comes from. They have about 10 million kids in that platform.
Great. Okay, well that's wonderful. I'd like to throw this out maybe to try to have some synthetic questions, looking across the different panelists. So you'd like people to think about what strikes them as the differences here. Do you see some kind of a continuum or some interesting contrast in how they handle the design space?
This is Kenji, and I had a question which I directed to the second presentation, but I also wanted to kind of throw this out to the general group, which is how it's a sort of a generic question about how capable these designs are for picking up on individual differences or group differences, either by ability or gender, ethnicity, whatever, and what might be kind of some of the best practices for being able to detect such sort of interactions with sort of group level differences.
Well, I can say we're doing a lot of. I mean, it's actually a very exciting, challenging computer science problem to actually do this kind of analysis. We have actually we can play back verbatim anything that any kid has done, including mouse hesitations and stuff. And so the question is, how can you then start reasoning about clusters of kids in terms of reasoning, especially when you start including the history that you have over play of not just one game but several games. It's a really hard problem, and we're now just publishing papers in NIPS and elsewhere on how to actually analyze it.
This is Greg. So we've been finding sort of, well, I would say the biggest two variables that predict performance are, of course, prior knowledge in math, and then game experience. So we've managed to create a game that requires a little bit of game skill and a little bit of math skills. If you just look at gender, boys tend to perform better than girls, but if you partial out game experience, then that gender difference goes away. So
how do girls respond to that, though?
So we, one of our studies was.
Was your game social?
well, I mean, no. It was intended kids are sitting next to each other and they could talk if they wanted to, but it was the social part wasn't built in specifically.
Yeah.
So we did a avatar choice study where we had a female-looking character and a male-looking character, and narratives that went with the male, aggressive stuff or whatever, fighting to save whatever, and then there was a female one as well, cooperation or something. I didn't do the study, but the females didn't seem to matter. I mean, but the boys were really affected. That is, if the males got the female game, then they hated the game. If the females got the male game, it didn't matter. So the male or female games for females didn't matter, but for the males, receiving a female themed game, they rated the game as worse, way worse than if they got a male themed game. I don't know what that says. I think I do, but
right. And I think in Jeremy's work, it's a more traditional. They have the demographic data on the students, and they are looking at results by subgroups and finding demographic variables that interact with aspects of the treatment, and also they're able to do some of those analyses of workbooks and so on for particular student groups. They had a lot of English language learners in their data set, being in Texas, as you might imagine. And that was something they attended to pretty closely, I would say, in a fairly traditional way.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, good. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to speak over you, Jeremy.
In fact, one of our reasons for doing the larger scale things is because we kept running into what I came to call the boutique critique, which was that, well, that's very nice in that school, but my school is different. It won't work in my school. And so, we want to find out, is it only certain kinds of schools or certain kinds of teachers or certain kind of kids who this is good for?
Right. So let me ask you all a question. How do you manage that tension between demands for evidence, and particularly demands for evidence with respect to the things that schools care about, which tend to be related to traditional measures of achievement, and wanting to keep the design space open long enough that you feel like you have something that really works well?
This is Greg. We try to confront it head on. So we give measures that look like standardized tests, procedural as well as conceptual.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, funders would have a fit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they're also more credible when we go recruit teachers and districts. And it's just it's not just playing, or it's not like the science fair guys coming to use up their kids to do some silly experiment. So we try to make it as relevant to schools as possible.
And I would say our core thing was sort of a both ends sort of strategy to this, where we deliberately measured things very close to what Texas measured when we were in Texas, or Florida when we were in Florida. And we also measure things that go beyond that we can argue are valuable for kids' future development. And so we don't collapse our measurement to only what the schools are most pressured about, but we do measure what they care about and show our alignment to it.
Mm-hmm.
And in many cases, what our data would show is we're marginally better learning than standard curricula with regard to the things the state already measures, but much better learning when you look for deeper outcomes. And I think many innovations have that profile, that unless you're careful to measure a wider spectrum, you may not see the benefit.
Right, right. Zoran, do you have a comment on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, that is the challenge. I mean, a lot of times when I measure these things, right, so sometimes you can, there could be some particular process of instruction early on that can have an effect much later in the actual whole body of the curriculum, and you just won't see that, even though your initial tests on incremental progress will show improvement, right? So you may have just done really well on this intermediate test, but you may have introduced a conceptual boundary that prevents them from getting to algebra. So I think what I'm hoping we can do is look at some of these long-term effects if you can span a lot of material with and track everything through this process. But of course, it will take time. Everybody wants play the game once and do the test again, and you'll do way better. And of course, as Alan was saying, it has to be a blended kind of experience with a lot of different things. And so what I want to show is that no matter what you blend it with, everything should be better. And I think that's a possibly more realistic goal.
Well, I want to bring this to a close because I realize it's getting late, especially for those on the East Coast. But I want to thank our three panelists again. I think this was really stimulating, and I really regret having to close it because I see some great questions in the chat box. What we're hoping will happen after we post the record of this webinar is, in fact, that some of you who had questions we didn't get to discuss or who reflect on this will, in fact, post comments, and we'll have a thread of discussion around it to continue this. For those members on our technical working group, we'll also take up these issues when we have our next meeting, and it gives us some concrete examples to kind of frame our discussion, which I think will be very helpful. So I thank everyone for your participation. I think this has been a great start to the webinar series. And again, thank you to our presenters, Greg and Zoran and Jeremy, for helping us think about some of these issues and giving us some rich research examples to look at.